Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next session in our series called Conversations on Innovation. Today, we're really pleased to have with us Dr. Kelvin Droegemeier, who is the former director of OSTP under the previous administration. And he has agreed to spend a good deal of time talking about his perceptions and impressions of his time in OSTP with both what we call a retrospective view and hopefully a prospective view about where things are going. This session is organized by the Center for Innovation Policy at the School of Law at Duke University, and it's co-sponsored by the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. I will talk with Dr. Droegemeier for about 45 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. And my colleague, Stuart Benjamin, and I will be handing off questions back and forth, and we will put them in front of Dr. Droegemeier. If you have technical problems, please use the Q&A function to let somebody know, and there will be a person who will communicate with you about helping you fix your problems. And instead of using the chat, we will also be using that Q&A function as well for the Q&A part of our program today. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Kelvin K. Droegemeier. Dr. Droegemeier, as I indicated, served as the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, under the White House. He led OSTP in its coordination of science and technology initiatives across the entire federal government. His background is in extreme weather, numerical weather prediction, and data assimilation. Before joining the previous administration, he served as Vice President for Research and Regents Professor of Meteorology at the University of Oklahoma, where he joined the faculty in 1985 as an assistant professor. In his 33 years at the University of Oklahoma, he generated more than $40 million in research funding and authored and co-authored more than 80 refereed articles and 200 conference publications, a busy man indeed. He also co-founded, directed, and led the National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center for Analysis and Prediction of Storms, and served as the co-founder and deputy director of the NSF Engineering Research Center for Collaborative Adaptive Sense of the Atmosphere. Dr. Droegemeier also served 2 6-year terms on the National Science Board, the governing body for NSF, including the last 4 years as vice chairman, having been nominated by Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, and twice confirmed by the United States Senate. He also served on and chaired numerous national boards and committees, and is a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Born in Kansas, Dr. Droegemeier earned a BS in meteorology from the University of Oklahoma and an MS and PhD degree in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So it's without further ado that I'll begin our program, and I think that we have a lot to talk about. Yesterday, as many of you know, the Senate passed what is now called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, formerly called the Endless Frontier Act. And it is designed to help, as many people say, the United States sustain its competitive advantage in the future years, particularly in terms of what many people perceive as the rising competitive threat from the People's Republic of China. And so it's a very fortuitous time for us to have Dr. Droegemeier here. So let me just ask you, just so we can get the current events on the agenda, why was yesterday so important? What does it really mean that Congress actually took this up, and given all of its difficulties of passing legislation, they got a very solid, majority to pass this, and now it moves on to the House. So can you give us your perspective on this?
Absolutely, Dennis. Well, let me thank you and your colleagues so much at Duke University for organizing this event. It's an absolute privilege to be a part of it. I want to thank all of those who are participating today. It really is an interesting time now, as you mentioned, with the Senate passing the bill. I actually testified before the Senate Commerce Committee, I don't know, about 6 weeks ago, I guess, on one of the foundational elements of this bill that you just mentioned the name of, called at that time the Endless Frontier Act, named essentially in deference to Vannevar Bush, who really was the foundational father, if you will, of the National Science Foundation. And the Endless Frontier Act had several pieces of it, but ultimately its focus was really a couple of things. One is to really supercharge the funding of the National Science Foundation, which is an extremely important agency in our federal portfolio that funds the bulk of basic or foundational fundamental non-medical clinical research in the country, computer science, mathematics, physics, geosciences, biology, education, and so on. And NSF, as I testified, had not really fared as well as other agencies over the years, especially back in the 2007 America Competes Act, which sought to double the budgets of Office of Science and DOE, NIST, and also NSF. That doubling really didn't happen. And so NSF, to some extent, has been left behind for a variety of reasons. And I think what's important about this bill and the foundational component of it is really to say, and we saw this in the pandemic in extraordinary ways, that NSF is really a very, very important agency in our federal portfolio of funding a lot of things that allowed us to address the pandemic. Basically, every one of the 7 directorates at NSF was heavily involved, had its fingerprints all over the solutions to the pandemic, whether it was computer science, whether it was fundamental mathematics, biology, DNA sequencing, and so on and so forth. So it was an all hands on deck. Certainly NIH and CDC and others played a very, very important role, but NSF really was critical. And I think a lot of times folks didn't quite understand, in particular in Congress, what NSF really did. They understood it, I guess, but they didn't really perhaps appreciate how investing in fundamental research really paid dividends down the road. And so we saw that, I think, very, very well in the pandemic. So the original bill sought to really bolster NSF's funding, but the second piece of that was to create a new directorate, or a new, at least in the early days, a new element of NSF that would focus on technology and transition of basic research into technological innovations that would benefit society. And that's where that word innovation comes in. At the end of the day, where the bill landed through a lot of bipartisan discussion, through testimony that myself and others gave, was basically still intact, the things I just mentioned, although the funding, I think, was not as significant in its increase from the Senate side. It increases the NSF base core budget by about $2 billion a year over 5 years. It puts about $29 billion a year, $29 billion over 5 years into the new directorate, and does some other things as well. The important point, though, is that this new directorate will have to link with, and this is an important point I made in my testimony, link with and work across all the other directorates. And so even though the core program budgets are going up by a more modest amount of $2 billion a year across all the 7 directorates, the new directorate will, I hope, be funding, co-funding and joining with the other directorates to fund activities to transition research outcomes into more technological innovations for society. So there are other things in there as well, but I think to your point, Dennis, that the vote was in the Senate something like 68-32 or whatever. So it really showed bipartisan support. A lot of changes happened, but at the end of the day, I think a healthy NSF is so important for the future of our country. So a very important day, as you say. Now it goes to the House. The House has its own sort of thoughts about this. The House Science Committee has talked a lot about, they're a little bit more focused on fundamental research versus, say, more applied research. But I think they'll work out the differences. Education, workforce development, STEM education, very, very important there. So I think we're seeing a lot of really good bipartisan interaction. And you use that word competitive, Dennis, in the title of the bill. And it goes back to, the America Competes Act in 2007, the
Right.
AICA that followed it, the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, and now we have the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. So that word competitiveness, and I know we'll talk about China, is very, very important in terms of us competing on the international stage, while we also collaborate internationally as well. So
Sure.
well, I hope that gives you a perspective of what the bill is about, but it is a very exciting time for science in America.
Right. So one hopes that, unlike the America Competes Act, this relationship between authorization of the money and the actual appropriation actually occurs. I mean, are you more optimistic than we ended up finding ourselves with the America Competes Act?
I am, and you make a great point, Dennis, that this is just an authorization. The appropriators can do whatever they want, but I think there's a very, very strong signal here. And of course, with Senator Schumer being the majority leader in the Senate, I think there's a strong appetite bipartisan to work together to deal with these issues. And it's not just about competition with China. It's really about America doing what it does best, and that is lead the way, as we did with the vaccine development and so on and so forth with the coronavirus pandemic. We are really the role model for the world, and a strong NSF, a strong research and technology enterprise are absolutely foundational to that. So I do hold out hope that we will see an appropriation that will follow this, hopefully, and really, it perhaps even be larger than the authorization level. Who knows? But hopefully, it will at least be what the Senate passed in the committee process. We'll get to something that doesn't diminish what is already there.
I'll keep my fingers crossed as well. Okay, so the title of our program today is a retrospective and a prospective look. So let's go back to 2017 and when you arrived at OSTP. What were the burning platforms that you were asked to address when you took the role on, and what were the issues that were front and center in terms of both the president's instructions as well as what you saw out there as the things that needed to be addressed?
Right. So it's a great question, Dennis. And I would just say that, I came in 2 years into the administration, so a lot of things were already underway, a lot of great people at OSTP. I think the perception in the community was, well, nothing was happening. And it turns out that wasn't the case. In fact, those who came to OSTP basically on the day one were talking with the administration about, how do we sort of staff up OSTP? What's the leadership structure going to look like, and so on. So they actually started talking with people very early on about the directorship. So contrary to popular belief, it wasn't that nothing was happening. The second point is they were bringing people in from all different agencies and structuring an agenda. So when I got there in early January 2019, the lights were definitely on. A lot of great things were happening, but also they were waiting for a Senate confirmed director to do certain kinds of things. And I brought in perspective, I think, from academia, 3.5 decades in academia and research and things like that. Somebody who'd worked in policy as well, so that I was an additive, element to the organization. It wasn't that nothing was happening until Kelvin got there. It was a lot of incredible things were happening, and I came in and was able to add some sort of other things to that. The focal points for me, basically, as an academic researcher, was to unleash discovery and innovation in every individual in this country who had the capability, the desire, and the training, to go out and do great things in science, research, and technology, and so on. But the other thing was we need a long-term horizon in terms of planning. We don't want to just think even a decadal survey or the next budget cycle. We want to think 30 to 50 years into the future. So we started talking about that. Let's frame America's arc of where we're going, not just in terms of a shorter time scale, which is important, but a much longer time scale. Also talked about multi-sector partnerships, and this is something in the bill that we just talked about is a great potential. And I was a little disappointed, and I mentioned this in my testimony, that there wasn't more in there about partnerships with private industry, of joining forces, especially in technology, where we have many companies that are trillion-dollar companies, very, very high-dollar companies that could join forces with federal agencies in ways that we haven't done before. But I know that the director of NSF understands that, and he's very, very keen on doing that. So that, I believe, will happen. But those partnerships are important. And of course, building the workforce of the future and integrity in our values, advancing our values at home and abroad. So those were kind of the things that I focused on when I came there. But the industries of the future was an agenda item that was already well underway there. We kind of called those 5 different things: artificial intelligence, quantum information science, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and advanced communication. Those were kind of the foundational elements of what were going on there. It was very, very important. And so as we'll talk about, there was legislation ultimately. There were now centers and institutes that are funded by DOE and NSF. So huge success there. And that is a major focal point of this new bill that we just talked about, is competition internationally in those areas. I also focused, of course, on the 5th National Climate Assessment, which is something that those who were at OSTP were waiting for the director to come in and do. And being a meteorologist, I certainly understood that arena. So that was, to your point of your question about what were the priorities, that was a priority to get that going. STEM education report that came out right after I arrived, or actually, excuse me, right before I arrived. I had a little bit of input on that, lot of great things there. The other thing, Dennis, was standing up PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology, and we'll talk about that later on. But that, of course, took a while to make happen. So several other things that we did in terms of Earth system predictability, and for example, nominating an NSF director, because the current director, who was director at the time, her term was coming to an end, and we wanted to get somebody in there who could carry on the tremendous foundation that she had laid. And so, those kinds of things take time. So those were kind of my priorities coming in, and the priorities of the administration, and certainly, workforce development, and making sure that we were engaging every corner of America in our science, technology, research, and education enterprise. So that hopefully gives you an overview of both what I found when I got there, which was a very, very active OSTP, but also we continued to add staff, we continued to add new activities we were working on, and it was really, really an extraordinary thing.
Oh, that raises a very interesting question as well, and that is that what surprises did you find? The Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, is a very important place. But when people actually see the numbers of people, the budget, etc., they're a little bit, worried that wow, all these priorities. And so, what were the surprises that hit you, right when you took on the position?
Yeah, well, I'd worked with OSTP in the past. I was very familiar with it. Participated in an effort in 2016 to sort of write a series of recommendations for the next administration. This was before the election, so we didn't know who was going to win. But so I knew it pretty well. But to your point, you don't really know an organization until you're actually in the organization. And what I found was an incredibly dedicated group of extremely talented people. People who go to OSTP are the cream of the crop. And so our budget, as you suggested, it's small. It's $5 million. And when you add in travel and you add the permanent staff that are there, the budget, finance people, and other folks that are permanent staff, it doesn't give you a whole, money to run conferences, and it doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room. So we depend very much on federal agencies to detail folks to the White House. And I can tell you that they were so giving of themselves, basically of their top people, to come over to detail for a year or 2 years, because it both enriches the individuals who are coming over, but when they go back to their agency, they bring back that extraordinary experience of being at the White House and working with all the different components of the agencies that engage with OSTP. So I wasn't surprised by that. I think that what I was really surprised about was, how many things were being worked on. A lot of folks don't know that OSTP has a huge national security portfolio of a lot of deeply classified work and so on, as well as things like physical science and engineering and biological science and health and all those kinds of things, the environment, and national security is a big thing. And so at any one point in time, we had about 90 different policy streams underway. And when I say that, what I mean is activities that would result in perhaps an executive order, a report to Congress, maybe a report in some other way. But when I came in to prep for my confirmation hearing, I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to come up to speed on all these things, a lot of which I knew about, but other ones I really didn't. And I was just really blown away by all the amazing things that OSTP did. And I think at our peak, we had all of about 90 people there. And if you subtract the budget and finance people in terms of policy folks, there's probably about 50 or so people working on those 90 or so things. So an amazingly dedicated, productive staff. And we did a lot of work and produced a lot of really good outputs, I believe.
Great. We mentioned competitiveness at the start of our discussion today. What were the imperatives driving the concern about competitiveness when you were at OSTP? I mean, you had a great deal of attention paid to China's rise and what that potentially meant for the United States. There have been lots of discussions about U.S. R&D performance. There's a lot of people who believe our patent system is broken and needs to be fixed. The European Union is very active in terms of its policies. So what really stuck out for you when you were looking at the horizon, and what did you see coming down the pike as something that made this concern about competitiveness very imperative to deal with?
Yeah, well, I think that certainly the things you mentioned, the rise of China and globalism generally, I think fundamentally it was the desire of us to see America lead, and that doesn't mean that we don't collaborate with other people. I mean, when you look at a faculty member, you look at the research group, you look at a department, you look at a university, what they want to do is they want to grow, they want to be the best. And so that's really inherent in our DNA, I believe, is that we want to go do great things and be the best. And so when you look at things like student academic performance measures and the fact that we didn't have, I think, the type of participation across America in terms of diversity and all zip codes across the country and so on, we felt that we were really punching below our weight. And so you look at the rise of other nations, which we celebrate in science, right? We really get excited when we see other countries publishing landmark papers and we see researchers and students in other countries doing great things. But it became obvious that as other countries are raising the stakes and are becoming better, we wanted to make sure that we were the destination of choice, that we maintained our leadership role, because fundamentally, Dennis, at the core of this is really our values. And we get into this when we talk about research security, but working with allies and like-minded partners who share our values of research integrity and ethical behavior, extremely important. And so when you think about thinking about us competing and so on and so forth, we want to collaborate, but we want to make sure that we not only lead with our science and our outcomes and our technology and our research, but we are the beacon in the world of ethical behavior and values, conjoining ourselves with other nations like Australia and the UK and Canada and so many other partners that we have. So those were really, I think, the drivers for us to say, we need to be more competitive. We need to, up our game. We need to put policies in place to make sure we can compete there. As you mentioned, Europe put forth some policies like GDPR and other things like that, and that weren't really, I think, kind of the way that we would actually do it in America. We led the way through the good work of Michael Kratsios, who led OSTP until I got there. Ethical behavior of artificial intelligence and the principles of using these advanced technologies. We led the world in putting those out there and bringing folks on board with that sort of thing. So leading can mean multiple things, but we felt again, our values, our science, our research, we really wanted to make sure that we remain the destination of choice for people around the world as we collaborate with others.
Right. Yeah. That clearly was a part of your priority, this attention to values and the norms and the integrity of the research system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Let me ask you, as a former faculty member, I taught courses on comparative science and technology policy, and one of the first things I would always tell my students is the U.S. doesn't really have a science and technology policy. We don't have a Ministry of Science and Technology like many other countries, or Ministry of Research, and most people would say that OSTP was never designed to be that, and doesn't up to now really hasn't performed that. But that raises a question: do we need to have such a ministry in the United States? Do we need a place where all roads lead to this, type of organization, so that there is the kind of coordination and integration that might be necessary to sustain our long-term research success and improve our research performance over the long term? Would we benefit by having an organization like a ministry dedicated to that function?
It's a really great question. In fact, to the first part of your question about an S&T policy, Jack Marburger, who came before John Holdren leading OSTP, he felt the same way about we think about science policy, but do we really understand it as a sort of a intellectual endeavor? And so he said we need a science of science and technology policy, and NSF to this day I think has a program that's titled exactly that, to where we can really think about taking a scientific approach, a thoughtful scientific approach to science policy in this country. So to your question, when I engaged internationally, which we did a lot of us in OSTP did, we had an international element to OSTP where we involved with G20, G7, ministerials, things like that. I would meet the ministers, as you say, the science or education, mostly the science ministers of other countries. And I look at the US, and we have like 26 federal agencies, and they're all based in most of them, not all of them, are based in cabinet departments and so on. They have their own strategic directions and plans and so on. And so I think that although what we have is a system that has its pluses and minuses, it's uniquely American. It's almost like a university. People who come in from, say, a very structured environment like the military, they come into the university environment, they're like, this is chaos. How in the world do you get anything done?
Right.
But in fact, it actually works quite well, I think, for us based on the historical evolution. And so one of the things about OSTP is we have this thing called the National Science and Technology Council, which is formally chaired by the president. The president basically delegates that authority to the OSTP director. And it is the formal mechanism by which all of the agency heads, usually presidentially appointed, Senate confirmed, get together and we coordinate on policy and planning and prioritization across the entire federal government enterprise. And there are hundreds of people involved with this, but the beauty is it gets all of those agency heads at the table. Now, it works extraordinarily well. It's not a ministry per se, but in a way it sort of is the balance between having a bunch of individual autonomous organizations and having a ministry that is basically a completely, sort of singular top-down focus. And I think it works quite well for us. So I think the role of OSTP is actually about right. It's a unique animal in the sense that it's one of the so-called 12 components of the White House, like National Economic Council, National Security Council, Office of Management and Budget. It's one of those, but it's also an agency. And what I would say about OSTP, the one thing it doesn't have formally, except in very narrow areas, is directive authority, basically to say, here's something that we direct agencies to do. OMB absolutely has that. National Security Council has it. I think OSTP would be well disposed to actually have a directive authority. Now, it's operated sort of informally with that in some ways in the past, where it's worked okay without having it. But I think formally having it would change some of the dynamic of OSTP within the White House and allow it to do some things that right now is a little bit more inefficient in terms of how things actually work. So I think elevating the OSTP director to a cabinet level position was a good thing. Though I think, frankly, one concern I have is you want to make sure the OSTP director does not become removed from the constituency. And for me, that was all the researchers around the country, all the grad students, the folks that are the next generation and so on. Because I'm a professor and that's just how I'm wired. I want to interact with those folks day by day. I want to get together with them, want to hear from them, and I think once you're a cabinet official, it becomes perhaps more difficult to do that, but we'll see how it plays out. But I think it's a pretty good idea.
Right. If you, Eric Lander, as you may have read, has now been confirmed. Right. And I gather he's in place. Is there a sense that he will benefit from this designation as a cabinet level person? I understand the shortcoming. What will he be able to do that you wish perhaps you might have been able to do? You indicated, authorize other agencies, etc. But as a cabinet position, he still can't authorize other agencies.
Yeah, he can't direct other agencies, and there's no agency that reports to him. Like, for example, right. NSF and NASA are both independent agencies. So the OSTP director has oftentimes been the kind of the voice of those agencies in the White House. I think this is a very important experiment to run. And I think that one of the things that it does, I believe, is it puts science at an even higher level. Now, I have to say that when I was in OSTP, one of the things I always said was I made sure science was at the table, and this was true. And I never was inhibited in doing that at all. It was never, no OSTP director, doesn't count or anything like that. But hierarchy does matter in the White House. There are positions like assistant to the president, deputy assistant to the president, the special assistant to the president, and so on. And so even though the OSTP director is what's called a principal a lot of times in many things, oftentimes I sort of felt that OSTP maybe didn't have sort of that equal seat at the table as some of the other folks, for example, in dealing with issues of foreign influence and so on and so forth. So I think it's an important thing to do, provided that it doesn't move the OSTP director too far from the community. And I believe it's a very important experiment to run. So I think good things are frankly going to happen because of that.
Good. Glad to hear that. Let's talk a little bit about China for the moment. Clearly, a lot of the legislation that just was passed by the Senate and a lot of the discussions, a lot of the time that you spent when you were in place was built around responding to the so-called China threat or the rise of China, etc. And it seems to me that there were a number of areas: China as an economic threat, China as a cyber threat, China in terms of military threat, just a broad array of areas where China was perceived as having some kind of threat to the United States. Can you talk a little bit about how that built up, and how that was it real, or was this a lot of hyperbole we were seeing in the media? Because one wonders, we for 40 years almost, we've had S&T collaboration with China was very productive and a very important part of that relationship. And all of a sudden, that part of the relationship, the S&T part itself, became the source of contention and problems. So maybe you can give us some perspective of what that looked like sitting in OSTP at the time.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very important question. China is a competitor of the U.S., but it's also a collaborator. And I think it's a threat. I think there's no question about it being a threat, but it's also a partner in a lot of ways. As you mentioned, I talked about China a lot in our work on research security and so on. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we really want to work with nations that share our values and that we can trust. And China is not really strong on either one of those points. And that doesn't mean we dismiss them. But when I say China, let me make clear, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, the People's Liberation Army. I'm not talking about, rank and file Chinese individuals. It's really the government that we're talking about here. And so, we talked about the act that the Senate passed yesterday. It's got the word competitive in there. So I think it's very clear, and I can tell you, I've seen a lot of classified information, a lot of analyses that are done to where these threats are real. And the thing about China, and I mentioned this earlier, is that China plays the long game. They think 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And I think that the present leadership that is there and the things that have happened since that individual came into power really are game changers. They really changed the calculus of the engagement with China, where that wasn't the case previously. So, I think when you think about, the so-called power competitions and so on, Russia is really, I think, mostly a cyber threat. They're still very much a military threat, but they're much more on the cyber side, whereas China, much more on the economic, the technology, and the military side. Mm-hmm. So, that they really do play the long game. And a lot of people would say, well, when we talked about Huawei, well, Huawei is not doing anything bad. Look, they're putting all their stuff in there. It's fine. But the thing is, you have to understand, they're getting a foothold technologically in areas where they're going to be there for 30 years. And so they're very patient in terms of these kinds of activities, and they're not going to show their hand right now and cause the whole thing to crumble. Of course, they're going to go in there and they're going to put stuff in and be very careful and deliberate about it. And then all of a sudden you wake up and realize that you weren't paying attention. So I think it really required us to take a very hard look at China as both a collaborator and a competitor. And we can talk about this. We talk about research security later on about where we landed with this. And in terms of welcoming individuals who share our values, who are going to operate with the ethical integrity and behavior that we require of individuals working in our research enterprise, for example. And if they fail to do that, just like if somebody from my own university fails to do it, which they did recently, we boot them out the door. And
right.
Hopefully so, because we don't want that kind of behavior in research. We have the trust of the American people. If we lose that trust, guess what? Funding for NSF, for NIH, for DOE, it goes away because they can't trust the researchers to do the right thing. And that's not who we are. And that's certainly not who we are today.
Right. Well, so something strange happened in the bilateral accord between the United States and China for science and technology cooperation came up for its 5-year renewal about the time you would have arrived at OSTP. And even though this is overseen probably by OES in state, OSTP had always played a big role because it was active in helping to facilitate that collaboration. It took a long while, but eventually the agreement was renewed in 2018. But it was renewed in a very strange way. Under the cover of darkness, in the shadows of the night. There was no ambassadorial or ministerial ceremony, and the document has never seen light of day. When you ask parties on both sides, everyone is very, very hush hush about it. And I wonder if you might give us, if you've, given what you can say, what happened there? I mean, all of a sudden it looked like the administration was not going to renew this, but then at the last minute, the 19th hour, it was renewed. And I know there are a lot of people are curious about the circumstances, why this ultimately was renewed, and what was meant to be different going forward, given the nature of the renewal.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and I'll give you an answer. It's going to sound like a political answer, but it's an honest answer from a scientist. I actually wasn't there when it happened, and I don't know all of what went into that, all the various things that you mentioned. I was aware that they happened. We kind of focused on it going forward of what we were going to do, especially with the work on research security and the work that we did in crafting the national security presidential memorandum that came out in January. But I wasn't involved in any of those discussions and the behind the scenes things that happened. So I'm curious myself, but I actually don't know.
Okay.
With all the stuff that's going on, I just okay, I'm focused on going forward, but so there may be other folks who have that knowledge, but I don't, unfortunately.
Okay. No, that's fine. But let's talk about international cooperation more broadly, because you've mentioned it a couple of times now. It seems that we've been heavily engaged in this under the previous 4 or 5 administrations. International cooperation with countries has been seen as a way to build long-term trust, and therefore during times of political difficulty help to sustain relationships that otherwise might be difficult to sustain. And I know under your predecessor, this was a very important part of his agenda. What were the big things that you did in international cooperation that stood out, as you look back now, that really were big successes from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And, despite it, I think what people had perceptions of in terms of administration, international cooperation in science technology was very, very important. We were super active in that. I mentioned earlier the AI principles, and there was something ultimately created called the Global Partnership on AI, GPAI, I think is how it went. But so very active. We attended G20, G7, all kinds of ministerials. We had discussions with multiple countries, Canada, UK, Ireland, agreements. NSF director participated, other people participated, NIST director, and so on. I started up an informal kind of a group of going back to what we talked about earlier, science ministers from around the world, started out very grassroots, talking about coronavirus issues. And it was really about, okay, what can we learn from one another in science technology? Are we, putting out special funding initiatives? What can we do to work together? Can we share, sequencing technologies? How can we work together? And it grew to be ultimately, I think, about 17 different countries. We'd have phone calls very early in the morning and just talk. And we looked multiple times at, is this still valuable? We asked the question, do you still want to keep doing this? And people said, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. Because it's very, very informal. We didn't have a lot of talking points or whatever. We were just there as researchers working together to make sure that we could address tough issues. So we did have a lot of international engagement, and it's a very big part of the portfolio at OSTP, as you mentioned. And in some cases, it's very, very formal, where you have ministerials and everything is kind of scripted, and then you have this other thing, which I prefer, honestly, the much more informal interaction. And you come up with readouts, and you come out with agreements, joint agreements of science technology, like you mentioned. And so it's a very worthwhile thing because it really sets the stage and the framework and the context for our 26 agencies we talked about before, to then go have their interactions with their counterpart agencies in other countries, and they have this framework under which they can operate. So it's actually very, very good and very helpful.
Right. One of the things that's changed is that the degree of asymmetry in science and technology capabilities. Before, the United States, Europe, and Japan dominated the world of global research. Now we've got a number of emerging market countries, not only China, but India, Brazil, Russia's in the game. We've got South Korea, places like Taiwan, Singapore. They're all now have much stronger research capability, and that degree of asymmetry, the lack of parity, that gap is closed now. Does that suggest that maybe we need a new way of thinking about this collaboration? Because it's much more peer-to-peer these days than it has been from the have to the have-nots or something like that. You know, there was more of a technical assistance quality to some of this, and that's no longer the case. Now we stand to benefit as much from this collaboration as they do from collaborating with us.
Absolutely right. And like I said earlier, we celebrate the achievements and the forward progress of these other nations. Most of the ones you mentioned share our values, right? So we want to partner with them, and we do. There are many more partnerships internationally, agency to agency, and you know, than I think a lot of people realize. In addition to all the individual scientist to scientist collaborations that happen, there's zillions of those, right? But I think you're absolutely right. And yet, you know, in fact, I think you look at the Large Hadron Collider, you look at the large telescopes, the Atacama Millimeter Array, you know, all these different things, various projects. They're of a scale and scope that even, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 countries alone can't do them. So when you band together, you're able to attack scientific problems of a much larger scope and scale. But you're also building, you know, international relationships. We talk about science diplomacy as a wonderful way for individuals to learn about other cultures and so on, and broadening participation, and having folks come and visit other countries. But it also is a way to make sure that we spread the important word about our values, that we sort of, a lot of times, just they're inherent, we just follow them. But when I met with science ministers from other countries, we talk about things like STEM education, we talk about global power competition, we talk about research security and threats and things like that. And one of the first things they wanted to talk about was, you know, those things with research security, and we would always come to our values, the fact that we have shared values. So I think the international science enterprise today is more vibrant than it's ever been, and that's a huge opportunity for science. And I think that, you know, lest folks misread the intent of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, I think that was the name of it that just passed the Senate. Competition also means collaboration, right?
Right.
So I don't think people ought to say we're shutting other folks out. It's, you know, you want to be the best, and everybody wants to be the best, but being the best a lot of times means collaborating with others and sharing the good outcomes and sharing the credit.
Okay. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to our audience. One of the things you sent me a very nice document about the achievements of OSTP during the course of the previous 4 years. And there were a lot of fascinating things in it that, as you suggested, most people, I think, don't know just exactly what was going on. One thing that was particularly impressive to me was the national mobilization that was taking place around artificial intelligence. And there was it seems to me that there was a concerted effort for the United States to come up with a national AI policy and mechanisms to ensure that the United States would be second to none in terms of the application and et cetera. Can you talk about what were the drivers, and how easy was it to get that kind of mobilization working?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, things like artificial intelligence in particular are global issues, you know, and I think there was work started in the previous administration on this. And I really have to give credit to Michael Kratsios, who really led that effort coming into the White House and packaged it, I think, in such a way that people really understood it. And members of Congress and agency heads and internationally, it was very clear that AI was the wave of the future. And it had been around for a long time, but now we had the data, we had the availability of data, the means to move data around and collect data and so on. So it really opened up tremendous possibilities. So, you know, Michael's work involved creating a framework for AI, a national framework. It was an executive order called the American AI Initiative. He got a lot of folks in Congress on board, the White House on board, very key players. It ended up becoming, you know, law now. Actually, in law recently, we have a national coordination office, plus substantial funding. I think the administration doubled the funding for AI and quantum information science over a 2 or 3 year period that resulted in several major institutes and centers funded by NSF and DOE at universities all around the country. So that's a really great example, I think, of how to do it. You're right. You come up with something that's very important. You get bipartisan support, but you have to sort of package it in a way that people understand the importance of it, and also then be transparent and say, you know what, there is the opportunity for nefarious uses of AI. So
Mhm.
when you think about the components of AI, they were R&D, they were workforce, the regulatory environment, safety and security, and principles and standards and partnerships. But the key thing was ethical, legal, and societal implications. You look at so many things like social media and splitting the atom and things like that. The science got way out ahead of our ability as a society to figure out how to do it. Who would have
Mhm.
thought that people would be, posting suicide videos on Facebook, right? But in the case of AI, the idea of ethical behavior and societal implications and stuff was put right in lockstep with the technology. So you have universities like Harvard and so on teaching, sort of embedding folks that are getting degrees in ethics, embedding them in computer science courses and stuff, which is really, really cool because we're now moving these agendas forward together. And so when Congress raises concerns about transparency and how is this working and what about the nefarious use? Yes, yeah, absolutely. But we are looking at that, we're studying that, we're trying to understand it and develop policy around it from day one. And so that I think was a really, really powerful thing that happened there. And it's true in things, other things as well, but AI in particular was very, very important.
Right, and that's quite interesting because I'm not sure many people would realize that the role that you had in that domain, dealing with how the technology gets implemented and what it means in societal terms, philosophical, religious, et cetera. I think those are clearly. I mean, that's why at Duke, for example, we have a science and society an initiative particularly focused on those kinds of things. Okay, two more questions. One about cybersecurity. That seems to, obviously, it seems to become the issue of the day. Next to China, it probably, since it does involve China to some degree, but next to China, it probably is the issue that I think most people are concerned about from a national security and what recently happened with respect to the Continental Oil Pipeline and et cetera. So can you tell us, where does OSTP fit in this effort to deal with the threats posed by cyber hacking and cybersecurity, and what kind of things were you doing during this period where you were the director?
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right, Dennis. To me, cybersecurity, and I mentioned this in a hearing one time, to me, it's probably the greatest non sort of kinetic weapon existential threat that we face as a country. It's a massive threat because a lot of cybersecurity threats don't take a lot of money. They don't take a lot of expertise. I mean, you gotta know what you're doing, but you don't have to be trained for 20 years and so on. So it really is an extraordinary threat. You have agencies that are dealing with cybersecurity from a threat point of view, but you also have agencies that are funding research like DARPA and NSF and NIST and DOE. So there's a lot of research that's going on. And part of the role of OSTP, and this is both classified and unclassified, is to facilitate and coordinate those kinds of activities. Duplication is important in the sense of competitive duplication, right? You don't want just one group working on one aspect of something and that's it. But you want to make sure that we're appropriately leveraging resources and coordinating and so on. The role that we had really at OSTP, again, from a policy point of view, was to make sure that we were bringing all the R&D experts to the table to understand what the key issues were and how we could really address them. And we put out a report on, I believe it's 2018, on a federal cybersecurity R&D strategic plan. So there are a lot of elements of cybersecurity, FBI and so on, investigative and things like that. But for us, as the Science and Technology Policy Group, it was, okay, what should be the strategic plan for cybersecurity R&D writ large across the interagency, across the entire federal government? What are the key issues? How do we address them? And so on. Then, of course, transitioning those research outcomes into both implementable solutions for federal agencies, but also the private sector taking the research and then innovating on it. Because again, the private sector is the one who really ultimately comes up with a lot of capabilities that are boots on the ground to actually thwart some of these threats. And so that was really our role, was one of understanding what science needed to happen, but being in conversations also about, for example, cyber threats of companies that we're looking to locate here in the United States from other countries. Do they pose a particular cyber threat being on US soil versus somewhere else? So it's a very broad range of issues that we dealt with there.
Oh, that's a big agenda. Really a big win. Okay, let me just ask you last about PCAST, because I think that I was very fortunate. Dr. Holderman, when he was in place, had asked me, and I talked to the PCAST group about trying to. I was just so impressed by the caliber of people that were in that room and the great minds that were being brought to bear on the U.S. Science and technology situation. Can you talk about how PCAST really functions, and does it really have influence? And you as director, did you really rely on it to a great degree to help you, understand some issues that were just difficult to sort out because of their either complexity or the politics or whatever may have been surrounding those issues?
Yeah. Well, you said it very well, Dennis. PCAST is a really, really important group. They're eminent scholars, people from industry, all across the board. They're really an amazing group. It's called a FACA committee, a Federal Advisory Committee Act committee, which has certain attributes associated with it. But it's a super important group. And what is important is that it's sort of the singular group at the White House level that is basically assembled to formally advise the president in the executive branch, in the executive office of the president, on all kinds of issues of science, technology, policy, research, and education. In the Trump administration, it got a bit of a late start because I didn't come there until 2 years into it. And Michael Kratsios he had prepared a draft EO that then I contributed to and refined and so on. And then we got it signed or whatever. And then actually putting PCAST together, since they're presidential appointees, there's a lot of vetting that goes on. There's a lot of, okay, let's have balance, let's get industry, let's have gender and ethnicity and geographic, all kinds of those things are very, very important to me. We get that balance there. And so it took us a while to put it together, but the group that we had, I think it was 16 people, absolutely extraordinary individuals. And we had a little bit different focus than what John did. I mean, John's PCAST, John Holder, he produced like 36 reports in 8 years. Extraordinary.
Yes.
And these are phenomenal works. I mean, they're just phenomenal works. Because of the time factor, we didn't have time to do that. So I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to assemble a group of people and really just focus on supporting their efforts in mining their brain power to focus on some very specific, a fairly limited number of very specific policy issues that are important to us, that we can then not worry about writing lots of reports because time didn't allow it, but creating policy that could then be implemented, say, through executive order, presidential memorandum, whatever. And so we did that. And I think it worked well. Now, obviously, we had more time, we would have done more, but we did produce, actually, imputing what I just said, we did produce a couple of reports. The last one came out in December of 2020. And it was focused on the industries of the future, those 5 areas I mentioned previously, right. Looking at kind of a new model of how we would, do kind of centers and things like that. We've ridden the centers and institutes horse for a long, long time. And frankly, and I don't want to go into the details, but there's a lot that we could be doing better there, I think. So there are a couple of things that I would just mention real quickly that I'm very proud of doing in this PCAST that we had. Number one was it created, for the first time ever, a group of undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, and early career non-academic professionals, say entrepreneurs. Because as an academic, as a professor, those folks own the future just as much as our mid-career senior folks who are the actual core of PCAST. And so we brought together a group of, I believe there were 10 of them from all over the country, and they were unbelievably extraordinary. I mean, they had great ideas, students, they're intellectually energetic, they've got all these cool ideas, and they added so much value to this because it's like, you guys deserve a seat at the table, you own the future. And it worked extremely well. And that was really cool to see happen. Not just a traditional PCAST, but bringing in this next generation of voices. The other thing I did was we had PCAST and the National Science Board work together collaboratively. They're both sets of presidential appointees, but they have very, very different missions. And so they're very complementary to one another. So we had National Science Board members liaising from the board into PCAST, working with us on these topics. And they brought extraordinary capabilities and understanding. So, and that had never, to my knowledge, it wasn't done the 12 years I was on the science board. So we felt that was important. So yeah, it has real influence, but Dennis, I would give you what I call the Alan Leshner rule. Alan, those of you who know Alan, he was a former CEO and publisher of AAAS and publisher of the whole science enterprise of AAAS. he taught me, he said, when it's true, when we served together on the National Science Board, he said, if you're going to write a report, make sure that there's somebody just dying to get that report. You can put out a report and okay, nobody really cares about this report. So the Leshner rule is, if you're going to do that, make sure that you've got one or multiple organizations saying, I can't wait until this report comes out,
right,
because here's all the things I'm going to do with it. Otherwise, forget it, So
yeah, that's a great point that a lot of people on the policy side don't recognize. I think that's really quite important.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump to some audience questions. We have a question here about the scientific workforce in the United States, and the question is: NSF has done a great job in funding scientific workforce development. Should this be an interagency effort? For example, the NIH Bridge to AI program will need a workforce skilled in both AI and biomedical science. Where are those people going to be trained, and who's going to ensure that we have a pipeline of bringing those type of people? This is a bigger question about jobs of the future. In other words, we're hoping that academia is figuring out what those jobs are, or feedback from industries coming in a way that, where do you think that issue can be best handled within our system as it now is organized?
That's a really, really excellent question, and workforce is hugely important. You look at demographic trends and so on. Are we going to have the scientific and engineering workforce, and not just those who are conducting the science, those who are supporting the science, the engineers, the welders, the folks that maintain HVAC. They're just as important to the success of science as all the other folks. And we're a team. We're truly a team. And so the best way I'd say to coordinate that, and it's how it's being done now, is through the National Science Technology Council, which means the whole interagency, all 26 agencies that fund in one way or another R&D, to have that conversation, because in fact it sort of hits every one of the topics that we talk about, whether it's AI or quantum or advanced energy technology or future fuels or nuclear or whatever. All of these things have workforce implications associated with them. So that's the place where these things get convened, so that we put workforce and things like international engagement, workforce and broadening participation as completely integrative, cross-cutting activities. We don't want to have them stand alone. We want to have them be a component, just like it was in the AI initiative and quantum. Say every one of these things has to have a workforce dimension in there, not just a separate workforce thing hanging out there on its own. And that's what NSTC is doing. So completely agree. The other point I would say is something I started when I was at OSTP, but we didn't have time to complete it. But I believe folks are kind of carrying the ball forward. And I give this analogy of sports, especially baseball. We don't really know what our bench strength is in this country. And I'll do a thought experiment. Suppose all of a sudden we say, okay, nobody else from the outside coming in. America's totally on its own. How would we replace those individuals? Do we have the capacity? Do we have, it'd take a while, obviously, it takes several years, but the kids in 4th grade now, kids in 8th grade now, do we have a sense of who they are? Are we going after them to help incentivize them? We always talk about this kind of thing, but I don't think we really understand what our nascent potential is. And so that sort of potential energy, before it turns into kinetic, we've got to understand what that energy is and start building it. And we don't have a handle on that. And we really need to as a nation. And so my thought experiment was in no way suggestive that we ought to cut things off. We want more people coming here and working here and studying here and staying here. But we also have to cultivate the talent from within. And we need to know what our bench strength is. So that's an important piece of this whole workforce thing that you mentioned.
And which sort of leads to another question, which is that do you guys get involved in immigration policy? NSF produces, the indicators report every 2 years and lays out a lot of data. But as you say, if one day we don't get the flow coming in for whatever reason, or we tighten the door coming in, as we had done, where can does OSTP have the positioning so it can lend an opinion in this debate about immigration? Because that besides the security of borders for all the obvious reasons, there is this need for high-end talent. And that talent is coming from a number of places, including China, India, et cetera. And we need to look at the results so far. Immigrants from Asia, for example, in terms of Silicon Valley, new venture startups have played a critical role in helping to drive the cutting edge of technological development in the United States. Can OSTP help tilt the balance in some ways so that that debate becomes more informed and therefore the results are more consistent with what we need to happen, rather than get caught up and wrangled in a lot of political, dynamics that prevent us from coming to terms with what really needs to be done?
Yeah, no, absolutely. OSTP does have a role to play, Dennis, and it's a very good question. So one of the things that we do is bring to the table the perspective of the of folks coming here from other countries, whether they're on H-1B visas, J visas, F visas, whatever it is, looking at the value proposition and then balancing that with, okay, what are the potential downsides to that? And so we talk a lot about, there have been so many foreign nationals who've won Nobel Prizes and so on and so forth. That's a very important argument that needs to be made. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of other factors at play in people's minds in terms of things like border security, like H-1B visas. How should they work? How should they be structured? And so what we did was bringing forward this notion of, with regard to American competitiveness, our technological advantages, our manufacturing capabilities, and all these kinds of things that we've been talking about. Very, very importantly, what is the relevance and the impact of foreign nationals? And at the end of the day, it's all about working with folks that you can trust, like-minded partners, and so on, people who come through the door legally and work in our science technology enterprise. We value that. That's fantastic. But if they're not willing to do that, and there are some bad actors, then you have to deal with that. And that's what we did with research security. But we worked very hard to not paint everybody with the same brush. And there's a lot of nuance to this, as you can well imagine. And so that was part of our role, is to get into the weeds of the nuance. Rather than just looking at top line numbers, let's look at really what the driving factors are. And I think OSTP, because of the folks that are there, the researchers, the scholars, the academics, and so on, we have that perspective, and collectively could bring that perspective to the table.
Okay. Kelvin, I'll jump in with the next audience question. So how do you decide how much you want to rely on the private sector versus in-house governmental capabilities and R&D development, given the potential differences of values and national versus private, worldwide, corporate interests, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it partly depends, Stuart, on the philosophy of the administration, and to quote industrial policy, which we don't really have a formal industrial policy. People are saying the Schumer bill is industrial policy. It's not. It's not at all industrial policy. But I think fundamentally the issue is, you look at where innovation really happens. It happens in the private sector. So at least in the Trump administration, I feel this way personally, that you see extraordinary things happen in small companies, in startup companies, in small, medium-sized. They're very agile. They can do incredible. I was just talking to a company this morning. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe you guys are doing this. The government is not as agile. And there's a great saying that says, in the private sector, you can do whatever the law says you can't do. Whereas in government, you can only do what the law says you can do. And those sets are not completely intersected, So I really think that the role of government is to fund, very importantly, the fundamental research, some of the applied development and so on, but then find ways for the private sector to not have to take a handoff, but to be engaged much further upstream. And we had a national summit on this issue of partnerships. And what we heard over and over again from private companies was, when you all are crafting these programs in the federal government, whether it's NSF or whatever, we want to be at the table from day one. We don't want you to craft the program and then say, hey folks, here's a cool program. Would you be part of it? So we talked about institution partnerships with major companies to set the stage for things that can then be done, at levels beneath that. Because this is where the innovation really happens. So I think the private sector plays a huge role. And, if you look at the R&D funding in this country, like almost 3/4 of it is the private sector. They both perform it and they fund it. And a lot of people would say, wow, look at that. The government ought to be doing more. I celebrate that, because they are reaping the investments of taxpayer dollars in basic research and going out and innovating the heck out of things, creating wealth, creating jobs, building the tax base, the economy. And not to say that the government shouldn't do R&D and shouldn't do some of those things, but the government is not very good at it, to be perfectly honest. The private sector is a whole lot better. But of course, there have to be guardrails, right? You have to have ethical behavior. You have to make sure that companies aren't misbehaving and those kinds of things. And that's where oversight happens, of course.
There's a question about Europe with all the attention focused on China. The reality also is that the Europeans want to have a competitive position technologically, and the European Commission, European Union is very, very active, obviously. How should the United States deal with the kind of pressures that are being placed on companies like Google and Apple? Because at the end of the day, is the consequence going to be that these companies are going to be hurt in terms of their ability to innovate because of the policies that are being imposed by our European colleagues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really good point. And in the technology space, I would say that there are some really important points of intersection and agreement with Europe, but some equally deep disagreements philosophically. And you look at, sort of private enterprise and in this country, and you look at how Europe operates, a lot of times there are some pretty substantial differences. And so this is where I think the State Department, OSTP, others come together, US trade representatives come together to try to hammer these things out. And honestly, I was hoping to get agreement on one particular thing with Europe before I left the White House, and it just didn't happen. And we said, okay, we're going to put the pedal to the metal. We're going to get this done. And we weren't able to. So sometimes you just run into a brick wall because philosophically, there's a fundamental deep disagreement about how things ought to look and what the regulatory environment ought to be. And a lot of times what we were asking for was not, something really, really special. It made a whole lot of sense to us, but for a variety of reasons, EU or others didn't agree with that. So we have to, I think, be smart in our policy. And this is where I think the State Department plays a hugely important role. They and Treasury as well.
Okay, great.
So, next question. The questioner says, I assume this is true, some previous NSF opportunities have asked for business and industry to share in R&D costs. Do you think the questioner asks if we think that'll continue and increase? I'm also just wondering whether you think that's a good idea. I mean, we've got the whole distinction between research and development, and the more you want to be upstream, then the less business industry might be interested. So I'm wondering what you see as the benefits of sharing R&D, having businesses share R&D costs with NSF.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. I think, when we talk about R&D, that can mean so many things to so many people. So I think there's no question, at least in my mind, I think most people agree that the federal government, because of the risk involved in fundamental discovery type research, really ought to be funding that. And we have to keep making sure that we push the narrative and the demonstrable narrative that fundamental research is important, even though it may not have any practical benefit on the immediate horizon. And so folks who say, well, we only ought to be funding what's going to cure cancer or whatever today or tomorrow, that's short-sighted. We absolutely, we didn't get to where we're at today because we followed that philosophy. We followed the philosophy of basic research, and that's why the COVID pandemic is winding down. So I think this is why I think partnerships with industry are important, say at the level of the NSF director and the CEOs of major companies, to say, okay, and also I should say private foundations, because a federal agency like NSF or NIH or DOE Office of Science, they have a particular role to play, but so does a private company and so does a private foundation. And when you look at their roles and you bring them together, you realize that when you have this coming together, you're able to do things more than just 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's more like 1 × 5 × 10 = 50. You get this really, big multiplier effect of not only just sharing in funding, but sharing resources, doing internships, externships, things like this. There's a lot of opportunity there beyond money. And certainly private companies will tell you, look, hey guys, we're not a bank, come on, don't come to us just asking for money. So that's why these conversations need to get equally nuanced to say, okay, what does this company really bring to the table? Because, when you have the NSF director calling the CEO of a major company, they're going to pick up the phone. You have a faculty member calling somebody who's 10 levels down in another company saying, hey, I'm going after a center, would you work with me? You're taking weeks and months to actually build the relationship. But when you do it at the institutional level, and I started this when I was acting director of NSF, you really have a framework now that you can build upon where companies aren't seen as banks, where they're not just funding all the downstream stuff. In fact, private companies fund a lot of basic research in certain areas like microelectronics and drugs and things like that. So, and I think more and more they see this shared proposition as a way to accelerate innovation in America, rather than just, hey, doing basic research and going hunting for the results and grabbing them as they fly over the transom and trying to do something with them. They want to be part of the conversation early on. I think that's really important.
Okay, we actually haven't talked much about COVID, and that's for a program on science and technology. Can you talk a little bit about what the role of OSTP was in the period of addressing the COVID pandemic? We know CDC played a key role in NIH, et cetera. But where was OSTP in all of this, and what was its core mission in terms of helping to address the problem of the spread of COVID and then trying to arrest it eventually?
Right. So one of the things we did several things. We were extremely active. In fact, I would say that when back in like March of 2020, I was personally spending, I think most of our folks were spending probably 80–90% of their time on COVID, but yet they were also getting all their other work done, which is just incredible. They were working from home, 14 hours a day. So we played a lot of different roles. One of the things we did was we said, okay, we're dealing with some really uncertain things here, masks, how long a virus persists on surfaces, all these kinds of questions were coming up. And of course, people were looking for answers. So we worked with the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, ASPR as it's called in HHS, and asked the National Academies to create a standing committee that would look at the emerging infectious diseases, not just now, but in the future. So that was one thing we did. We also created well, I mentioned this 17 different countries. We had these informal conversations. One thing that we did that was formal, though it was done informally, was basically to put out a call to all the publishers internationally to say, for some period of time, would you please make every publication immediately available, not behind a paywall, immediately available in machine readable format, so that folks could immediately get access to the science as it was coming out. And then in addition to that, it created a repository. Well, actually the repository exists, but created an initiative to make available high performance computing for scientists to come in and get very, very quick turnaround on reviews. They could request cycles and in a few days actually have access to computer time. This started out as kind of a grassroots effort with private companies, with universities. It became international, huge amounts of computer time available for people to run various models and so on, but also a repository of these journal articles where people could come in and apply their artificial intelligence tools to mine those thousands and thousands of publications for results that no one could read in a human timescale. So we also worked with universities on I convened conversations with presidents and chancellors and deans of medical colleges and vice presidents of research, of which I was one prior. And I said, look, what do you guys need? You're on the front lines, you're dealing, how can we help? Regulatory relief, can we work with OMB to kind of suspend some reporting requirements or whatever? And so we worked to do that, and OMB was very responsive there. So there were lots of different things that we did, convening this international group of people to talk about and make available. We shared a lot of information on clinical trials and so on. But I was also on the president's coronavirus task force. So we met sometimes multiple times a day, and it was very, very intense. But at the end of the day, with Operation Warp Speed and so on, things worked out really well and extraordinary achievements. Frankly, the big takeaway for me, and I've said this a lot, was, we learned a lot of lessons of how quickly and efficiently we could do things in the midst of a pandemic. Let's mine those lessons learned, which we did or started doing, and let's find a way that we can operate with the same degree of urgency and less red tape to accelerate the progress of science, not in the midst of a crisis, but in the midst of an urgency that science is important, science has to move forward. And we found that, a lot of the things that we thought were so important from a regulatory point of view, without sacrificing, safety or quality of science or things like that, integrity, that we could do them pretty darn fast and everything was fine. And so, we tie our hands, let's just be honest, we tie our hands in a lot of ways in a policy framework and in administrative requirements that, these things don't really have any practical value. So let's untie our hands and accelerate and help our scientists engineers who work so hard, let's make it easier for them to do their work. That was the real takeaway for me.
Okay, great.
So
Stuart?
this is sort of a riff off a couple of different questions, but you know that the research funding has gone down. You know, as development funding has been fairly high, research funding has gone down. That's what this new statute is, this bill is trying to deal with. You know, I assume most people on this call think it would be better to have the government spending more money on research. The obvious question is, okay, are there ways to make that more and less likely, right? So I mean, we can all say, okay, we want to have greater education. We want to let people know the benefits of research. Okay, yeah, we've been trying to do that for 30 years, and research funding has gone down. And we can talk about various kinds of threats and we've been talking that for 30 years, and funding has gone. Remember, Japan was going to eat our lunch back in the 1980s. So I guess I'm trying to think: is there anything that we now think we have learned that we think we can really implement in the future to prevent another drop in research funding? Or is the answer, we just need an adversary like China that's always out there? And so just like we needed the Soviet Union in the Cold War, we now need China in order to have research funding in this country.
Yeah, Stuart, it's an absolutely brilliant question, and you're spot on. And I think if you look at NSF in particular, you know, really well-intentioned people tried to get plus-ups, but it just never happened. And why was that? You know, we've asked ourselves a question, and continuing to say, just give us more money, which I'm not saying that's what NSF did. But you know, we have to have a different narrative, really. And I think the narrative today is one of really driven to some extent by China, certainly, but also the pandemic. I think the pandemic showed the power of science and the power of America in a global context of actually being able to develop these vaccines. And of course, you know, Pfizer and BioNTech are in Germany, but you know, this collaborative effort to develop these things, you know, I think there's unmistakable evidence of the power of science. Now, it's interesting because researchers and science are held in high regard by the U.S. Citizenry, have been for years and years. The General Social Survey shows this year after year. So it's not like it wasn't believed or supported, but somehow that didn't translate into dollars. And so I think the evidence is there now, both from a threat point of view of China and people recognizing, you know, we could get overtaken in the world leadership role, even though the curves have been, you know, poised to cross, and now they have crossed as far as federal investment and so on. That has happened, but I think it's a wake-up call. I think COVID really provided that, and certainly China is as well. How long that'll last, I don't know, but I think from a scientist point of view, what we need to be doing is continuing to show the value of connecting the dots of fundamental research to the outcomes that have really saved, you know, countless thousands of lives in this particular situation. But then saying, you know what, there are a lot of other examples out there that aren't maybe quite so dramatic, but are equally compelling in the, you know, the context in which they sit to make the case. And I think you know, the bipartisan support for the funding that we're seeing emerging, hopefully will ultimately get signed into law, is a great example of that.
Great. Okay, last question. We've talked a lot about research integrity and the sustainability of the U.S. Research endeavor. So let's imagine it's tomorrow morning and the headline reads in the New York Times or Washington Post, Chinese R&D spending surpasses the United States. Chinese GDP exceeds that of the United States. China assumes the leadership role of a number of international agencies, you know, rule-setting, agenda-setting agencies. What does that mean for the United States? In other words, could you talk a little bit about what's really at stake here? Because there are those people who suggest perhaps that there's too much hyperbole, you know, associated with these discussions. That, yeah, sure, there are a couple, you know, Chinese scholars who were engaged in nefarious activities, and yes, there are a couple from other countries who are also doing the same. But on the whole, you know, this is a system that seems to work pretty well, other than a few bad apples that are undermining things. Can you give us a sense of how serious this all was, and then really, again, what is at stake ultimately if we don't effectively address this issue? Yeah,
that's a great question. And so I would say, first of all, this threat is real and it's systemic. it's not just a few bad actors. And I went around the country meeting with various university groups. We bring multiple universities together, Southern California, wherever we went, Washington State. We bring people together because I wanted to hear about what their experiences were, but also to share with them what we were learning. And so one of the things that was very obvious, and you see this when you look at the FBI data and you see a lot of other things, this isn't just one or two examples at MD Anderson here and Tuscaloosa here and Duke here or whatever, or University of Arkansas. It's happening everywhere. And so it's a very real threat. If you understand that, again, the Chinese government, the influence it exerts over individuals here in the US with their families back in China, you'll realize that, there's a lot at stake here. And so in some sense, people are being used as puppets and pawns. Now, is it happening, everywhere all the time? No, I'm saying it's systemic. So it does happen, more than just one or two places. And it's not insignificant in its numbers. Talking 1,000 plus. What's at stake? You look at the graphs that say, okay, we're getting people. Other countries, China is catching us in number of patents, catching us in a number of publications, and so on. And those folks that would say, so what? I think it's important to have that conversation because it's a very legitimate question to ask. Does it really matter? I mean, don't we celebrate other nations doing good things? The answer is yes, but at the end of the day, Dennis, it comes back down to values and how people are going to use the outcomes of their work. Here in America, for the most part, our research enterprise has produced extraordinarily positive benefits for society, whether it's health, whether it's national security, whether it's economics. You look at the companies we have, by and large, it works really, really well. Basically, everything in China is related and linked to the Chinese Communist Party, and in many cases, the PLA. So then you have to say, okay, that's a different fundamental philosophy. So the why does it matter question relates to that. I'm far less concerned about, the rise of nations that share our values than I am with nations that don't. So it strikes me as very odd that China is still considered an emerging economy, a third world country. That's just simply the way it's classified right now. I have had a lot of Chinese students. I have a lot of Chinese colleagues. I value them greatly because I know their character. They're very, very good. They're wonderful folks. It's the government that is the issue here. And it's the government that the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and previous administrations have focused on. So it is a very ever-present threat. It's a real threat. And I think we can be the best at not just playing a strong defense, but playing a strong offense by adequately supporting our research enterprise, by leading with our values and making sure that those who come here seeking an environment in which to work that strikes their heart as being, yeah, that's how it ought to be done, that we welcome those folks here and we embrace them and we work with them closely.
Well, that's why I liked your point about engagement, because I think only through engagement can we really help to reshape, and realign some of these values so that whether it's lab safety or whether it's a peer review of grants or whether it's patent protection, whatever may be on the table, I think one of the only ways we're going to get progress and alignment is through engagement and continued discussion, and put our cards on the table and whoever's on the other side put their cards on the table and come up with some kind of general agreement. Otherwise, we stand the possibility of creating two systems that are in an adverse relationship with one another, and that's not going to do anyone any good, as particularly with respect to the solution of the many global problems that we face.
Right.
Concerns me if we walk away from the table because we don't like what we're hearing. That's exactly the time I think we should come back to the table. But that's just a personal commentary.
Right.
Well, Kelvin, let me thank you again for your generosity in terms of making yourself available for the discussion. You've been extremely forthcoming, and I think everyone who has attended this has benefited greatly from getting an insider's view of what being the director of OSTP is like, and particularly over the period in which you were in place at the White House. So I want to thank you on behalf of Duke University, the Center for Innovation Policy, and the Duke Initiative on Science and Society for coming and being with us today. And I hope we'll have other chances to interact with you in the future. And let me say thank you to our audience. for your participation. And also thank you to the team at the Center for Innovation Policy for working with our guests, putting together the technology infrastructure to make this happen, and providing us the stability to know that we would actually have a program today. So thanks to everyone, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye now.